Well, good afternoon and welcome to this workshop on the 6 steps towards a healthy parish as we come out of or move through this next phase of the pandemic. My name is Joe Swimmer. I'm the Executive Director of the CEEP Network, and we're very pleased to have you with us today. We are also pleased to have our terrific panel. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bob to make the introductions and thank them both for being with us. So we look forward to an engaging conversation, and off to you, Bob.
Thanks, Joe. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bob Flanagan. I am a priest in the Diocese of New York and a adjunct faculty member at General Theological Seminary and a instructor for Virginia Theological Seminary's lifelong learning program. So it's a privilege for me to be back with the CEEP Network and to speak with you all about mental health and as we've entitled this, the 6 steps to a healthy post-pandemic parish, and looking specifically at the lessons, several lessons from the Gospel of Matthew. And with me is Doreen Marshall from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And I'm going to let her introduce herself.
Thanks, Bob, and welcome everyone. I'm Doreen Marshall. I'm a psychologist by training and the Vice President of Mission Engagement at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, AFSP. And if you haven't heard of AFSP, we are an organization nationally that focuses on mental health education and suicide prevention. So, and it's great to be with Bob today.
Yeah. So thanks, Doreen. We're going to start off. I'm going to bring up my slide presentation here, and we are going to work from this. And if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to put them in chat. It's our preferred method. You can always afterwards at the end, I'll include my email address, and you can contact myself and or I can get and reach out information to Doreen as well. So as we dive into this, I hope that you can sit back and relax and take a breath and be open to learning. I'm going to start us off with a prayer that I feel can be. It feels right in today's environment for so many of the church leaders. So as we do in our church, the Lord be with you and also with you. So let us pray. Compassionate and healing Lord, you bring us into the light to be healed and dwell in peace. Be kind and generous with us as we open ourselves to others and you. Deal graciously and tenderly as we timidly step toward you. Do not judge us but recognize our faith and honor us for however far we've come. Our anxiety and or depression and fearful thoughts have held us back for so long. And at times we feel unworthy, but still trust in you. Hear this, our prayer, O God. Amen. So we start by looking at the 4 biblical passages that we'll use, that we're going to explore the dimensions of healthy emergence. If you today, if you read the Wall Street Journal, you had seen that there's an article from Elizabeth Bernstein. And in it, at the beginning of it, she writes, a lot of people have been asking me the same question lately. How can I cope with my reentry anxiety? And I think that kind of is a hallmark for us and for what we do as priests and church leaders. And we might think that reentry is a piece of cake for us, but my experience and discussions with others and my own vulnerabilities is getting back into in-person worship and still trying to figure out and maintain online presence, and what that means is particularly difficult. We're going to look at, we're going to use as our touch points these four different Matthean passages from those chapters 8 and 9, and we'll go through and look at each one. But I wanted to first start with just letting you know what they are, and the leprosy, the two blind demons possessed men, the two blind men, the two demon possessed men, and then the centurion's faith. We'll circle back to that one. So I'm going to bring in Doreen to talk for a bit, based on this quote from this week's article this week in the Church Times UK article that was looked at and reported on a study of the dramatic increase in referrals, mental health referrals that have been going on in the UK. And the article states this: clergy are now under immense pressure to deliver more than ever before, their traditional ministerial roles being added to by the demand for an ongoing online presence with correspondingly diminishing financial and human resources. It is hardly surprising that the rates of anxiety, depression, and burnout have skyrocketed. And that's referring to an enormous increase in that which has been seen in the UK clergy. We don't have a similar corresponding study in the US, but from my own anecdotal experience, it's similar. So Doreen, will you speak to this question of kind of the emotional state of things as you see it in your work?
It's an important question, and I would say that one of the things we've noticed is that across all caregiving communities or others, there's this sense of we had to pivot, for our work during a pandemic, and now things are opening up and we have to pivot again, and just expectations may be different. That, like you said, or like the quotes, there's this sense that people are now wanting things both online and in person, and that can be challenging. Overall, it's been a really important time to about mental health messages and messages of support, but also there's kind of this sense that we've been in this so long, there's been so many changes that now as we go to post-pandemic, we're going through another set of changes that's going to require us to accommodate. And so I think you're right that we're hearing more stress, more pressure to kind of now again and return to things in a way that's going to look different than they were before pandemic.
There, in the Wall Street Journal article today, it spoke about, there was a psychologist and neurologist who mentioned that the brain doesn't like what the is changes and the difficulty of in the uncertainty that's around changes. Do you see that as well?
Absolutely. And, I think we all have kind of different thresholds for this, right? So some of us are much more kind of go with the flow, and others like predictability. I mean, as human beings, we tend to like to know what's happening, but there's kind of a range of emotional responses in face of change, right? So, I think one thing we've been encouraging a lot of folks to do is kind of take your own temperature around this. Because if you're somebody who you don't kind of pivot easily with change, or it tends to create a lot of upheaval or stress for you, that this set of changes over the last year has probably been really tough. And we're about to head into more of them as we get more information, changes to mask mandates, that, taking your own emotional temperature, I think, and realizing that, it's not good or bad, it's just a difference. But being able to kind of proactively take care of yourself around it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think what you're saying is reminding me of a conversation I had with another priest recently who admitted how terrified they were at the thought of getting or having someone come down with COVID because of a decision to be in person or in terms of worship, or to interact with a clergy person, with a parishioner that and that may cause spread. And I think that there's a lot of that, and I agreed with her. And I think that there's a lot of that kind of latent or low level kind of steady anxiety that's a part of our work. And I mean, you see that across other caregiving areas.
Absolutely. You know, we've also seen it with educators or those working in schools, and this idea that, you know, that we gravitate towards certain fields and certain professions because we like contact, right? We like kind of the very nature of what clergy do. It's a high, what I think of as a high contact field, as our psychologists, teachers, and others. And we've had so much of that change for us this year, you know, against the backdrop of a real public health threat. And so, you know, thinking about how the very work we do and how we gravitate toward it kind of is compromised right now, and trying to, you know, follow the public health guidelines, but at the same time, you know, recognizing that our work has changed. I communicate with a lot of teachers, and this has been an ongoing stress for them as well. And they've talked about this idea of having to teach both in person and online, and it feeling to some people like, you know, nobody is completely satisfied with that option. And so, you know, I think that the bigger takeaway here is maybe just a recognition that while clergy are carrying a lot of it, it's really the nature of high emotional contact work that I think we're seeing, you know, many more of these stressors surface.
And we had a note, a question come up, and talked about, if I understand it correctly, it's not only just our own ability to adapt to these changes, but it's that of the people around us. And I think we will get into that sense of how do we as caregivers kind of manage the emotions of all the people around us. But perhaps you kind of tease that out a little bit at this point.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think if we, you know, my sense of it is it's impacting all of us, and we all have this kind of, as the person who put the question in noted, like this range of adaptability. And one of the things I've been mindful of is that, you know, people who have coped well during the pandemic, they may see different challenges to their coping now that we're moving to a post-pandemic world. You know, at the same time, people who weren't coping well probably will see, you know, kind of an eagerness to get back to something that looked like it did before, although I think we all have a recognition that it's not going to look exactly the same. So the only reason I bring that up is I think to not assume that just because someone was not coping well mid-pandemic, right, that they won't cope well going forward, or vice versa. And then I think the other piece is just tuning into our own adaptability and the stressors it brings as a way of finding empathy for those that are having a hard time.
What you're saying is reminding me that from the introduction of my latest book, when I talked about courage based on the work of Lord Moran, who's did a study of courage in the trenches of World War I, and he remarked that on one day he might have a soldier that was, you know, perfectly capable to doing what he needed to do, but an event, something happened the next day, and that same person was no longer capable of doing it. That things can switch, and we may not know what that is. That you know, as caregivers, as people that are caring for others in our profession, it may hit us, it may hit those around us, or it may be it may be something that that's unexpected completely.
Yeah, I mean, I would also add that it's dynamic, right? That it can change moment to moment and day to day. So to not, box ourselves or anyone into a category of not coping versus coping, because I think we all recognize that even just day to day life, on days when I've gotten enough sleep and, I'm feeling well rested and I'm eating relatively healthy, I may have more resilience than on days when none of those things are true. So to recognize the dynamic nature of that, particularly when it comes to our mental health.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's dive into a little bit into the in the scriptures here, the 4 passages that we have for you. But first, we'll talk about, just to give it a frame of reference for everybody, kind of where we're coming from, and perhaps this review for some folks, or could be some new information. Importantly to know, and I've given you the 2 books here as reference, but first, Elaine Heath, she's a professor down at Duke these days. She writes in a sense of kind of understanding this idea of being unclean. It had a physical, spiritual, relational, and communal dimensions. And I think in terms of our discussion today, we'd add psychological and liturgical for what we do. And then Frances Taylor Gensch, I think she's still down in Texas. She makes 3 important points about first century understanding of impurity. And in her book, a great book, Back to the Well, and she said impurity was not a sin. And I think that's important for us to understand, and particularly in frame of reference of what we're talking about, and was not prohibited. Purity didn't respond to social class, and impurity was a fact of life, particularly those that weren't living in and around Jerusalem. It was simply a fact of life and not of class. And also impurity was gender blind. And I think that that's an important one to state, as the scholars today understand how kind of male-driven commentary, biblical commentary has been. To have people like Gensch and Heath making these statements is reframing out our understanding of kind of what does it mean to interact with the holy, and under what kind of restrictions. And so we're going to lay this groundwork, and from this we'll begin to get into kind of what we mean and what I mean in terms of cleanliness in terms of the pandemic. So we had this in chapter 8. These should be pretty familiar passages for each person, but I'll touch base quickly here. Jesus comes down from the mountain with a great crowd following him, and a leper, and we like the English Standard Version, and behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you will, you could make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hands and touched him, saying, I will, be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to them. A couple things. Understanding in the first century, those with leprosy were considered by rabbis to be in a state of physical death. That's how difficult this was, a disease, and how isolating it was. No law, but there was no law prohibiting the touching of a person with leprosy, but the disease did carry serious ritual impurity. And the unholy in proximity with the holy was the problem. But remembering again, but unholiness and uncleanliness were a fact of life then. So what I want to talk about for a minute, and then Doreen, we'll pick back up with you, is how has our view of uncleanliness changed in the pandemic? And I'll reflect on a couple of interactions I've had with some other clergy, and to the point of one lamented to me how he had the difficulty he had as somebody who had COVID, and how he could feel himself being able to relate back to his congregation as someone who had kind of caught this disease. He's better and healthy, but still struggled with that understanding of somehow his interactions got him in a place where he caught this. and that he felt a pressure or a disappointment from his congregation that somehow he had slipped up. And I think that in some ways, some of what is going on here is kind of bringing to light the undercurrents that happen in the life of clergy. Think of the what are we, priests tend to be creatures of the altar, and if we think about the altar, what do we have? We have an altar rail. It's separated from everyone else. That space is separated. Those that gather in that area tend to be robed and tend to have some sort of robes of white on. Again, kind of a symbolic sense of purity, that the people can come forward only after having offered a general confession in our tradition. But there is that sense of we needing to be clean before we can come and approach the communion meal with God. And I think that's the challenge and difficulty that we face, that has been brought out. And as another priest brought up to me, gee, we have dealt with this before. We dealt with this, as clergy dealt with this in the time, the 80s and 90s around HIV/AIDS. And the difference, I think, is and one of the differences for us now is that we didn't really talk about what we did. And at some churches, they said, well, if you have HIV/AIDS, you can't come to the altar rail. We isolated them. And in fact, what we did was absolutely wrong, right? It wasn't, there was a fear of other people kind of catching, right, the disease. But the real risk was all of those of us who weren't, didn't have HIV/AIDS, of giving those people a serious set of illness, exposing them to something that was very difficult. And so here we are again, we're in this place of making decisions around the reception of communion, the interaction with parishioners, who has a mask, who doesn't have a mask, and when that plays out. And they're real difficult challenges for all of us to consider. Let's move over to the next one. We have this story here. Again, a little bit farther along in chapter 8, and when Jesus came to the other side, to the country of Gadarene, 2 demon-possessed men met him, coming out of the tomb so fierce that no one could pass that way. And behold, they cried out, "What would you have to do with us, O Son of God? You have come here to torment us before the time." And now a herd of many pigs was feeding at some distance from them, and the demons begged him, saying, "If you cast us out, send us away into the herd of pigs." And notice in this all of the layers of uncleanliness, right? The demon-possessed men were living in a unclean place in the tomb. They were violent and dangerous men, were isolated and socially distanced. Jesus sends them into pigs, who for Jewish people at the time were unclean animals. And then after they all run into the sea, though pigs can swim, they all drowned. And the townspeople come out and afraid. And there's this conflict in the story here of this isolation and fear of others and the redemption versus the economic loss of God's action and mercy and healing. And I think I've touched on this a little bit here at the beginning here, and just to continue on is what are some of these spiritual issues of uncleanliness? What about new members? When new members join our churches now, I mean, we're okay with all the people that we know, right? We have a good sense of our neighbors and who they are and what do they do. The real question then becomes, what do we do with these new people that have joined us, and how do we deal with them? On that level, there's also the question of status and And do we project on a status level of that certain people, given their economic status or given their general health status, or perhaps even the color of their skin, that do we stratify and make different changes to how we treat people in church? And do we need to be extra cautious about it at this time? I think these are some of the questions that that are there for us to consider in this. And also in the spiritual natures, we'd have to throw in some guilt and shame that are part of that. And I think that leads me back into a conversation with you, Doreen, is this sense of if we link the spiritual with the psychological, in your experience, how are the two different, and where might they overlap? I think that might be helpful for people to hear.
It's an important question. And so I often think about, the spiritual being, not where, I guess where they're similar is that both can be really an internal experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what someone's experiencing spiritually may not be as evident to others, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the same for psychology. I think where they may be different, though, is in terms of who people feel comfortable connecting with around those experiences, and what motivates them to connect around those experiences. And like you mentioned, in a faith community, right, there's kind of an assumption that we're all connected spiritually, and so this is a safe place for me to share what I'm reckoning with, right? Where from psychological issues, I think sometimes people have a hard time navigating that, like, who can I share this with, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I've been mindful of, that goes back to something you said a few minutes ago, Bob, is that I was struck early in the pandemic. I was talking with someone who was struggling pretty significantly with their mental health. And I had brought up something about, well, make sure, I think I had said to them, like, make sure you observe social distancing or something like that, that was really looking at the pandemic. And they looked at me and they said, are you talking about the pandemic? I can't even be worried about that right now. Like, they were in such internal distress that the idea that they have to do something to protect their physical health or relate to people differently was like, it was, kind of a hill too hard to climb. It was too much for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I only wanted to bring that up because it was eye-opening to me, because I've been carrying these two things, together. Like, I take care of, myself in a pandemic physically, and also I've got to protect my mental health. And for someone who's in, whether it's mental health overwhelm or spiritual overwhelm, kind of navigating the world simultaneously may feel like too much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think again, we had a note from in the chat about coping, and I think coping absolutely matters. I think it's and particularly that sense of introversion and the extroverts. I think in some ways, right, the joke is that the introverts, of which I definitely fall into that category at times, is we relished in the pandemic to we're by ourselves, we can really kind of manage how we're interacting in the world and at what levels, whereas I think I've mentioned to a few groups that I've spoken with lately of a church that was coming back together, and on Instagram they put up this picture of a half a dozen teenagers jumping up in the air and with no masks on, right? And it said, we're back, come to church, at this church, and part of me was really like, at that moment, like, are you kidding? I mean, how dangerous is this? I mean, why aren't there masks on those young people? Why aren't they more distance apart? And I realized that it was you know, it has nothing to do with the pandemic. It was just, or everything to do with the pandemic, but it was where I was in that moment. I think our coping skills go up and down. Is that your feeling?
Yeah, and I think you're right. Like, I think what people have experienced during the pandemic is really informing them right now. So if you know someone who died or got very sick, right? If you know, I have small children that are below the age of vaccination, so I may have a different perspective because of that. You know, I think that's what, you know, we're seeing. And there's been this sense, and I love the way you framed it, Bob, like there's been this sense of like looking around, trying to understand what it is we need to do, and getting so much mixed information, seeing so many different experiences people were having and are having. And so I think what's been different about this is in a time when we often look to other people for cues of how to be or how we should act, we've gotten all sorts of information that's probably left many of us confused, not sure if we're taking care of ourselves in the right way. And like you're saying, you know, these things also overlap with, I think, kind of the existential or the spiritual piece of what we experience.
Well, so kind of pointing back to this biblical passage where they have these two kind of demon-possessed people, right? But in you know, I worked at as a chaplain at a acute care psychiatric facility, and so I would often I would get the call either to you know, somebody wants to have a confession or wants to talk to a religious person, or the psychologists were at the end of their, you know, their rope with these people are frustrated with it and say, you know, we can't figure this person out. We'll bring in the priest, you know, and you talk to the priest for a while. We'll maybe he can bring something out. But so kind of putting aside the narrow sense of the biblical demonic, and brought it into the wider modern day understanding of psychology. What are those factors that you would see that tend to isolate people and correspondingly from a psychological factor can make them angry or very difficult to be with?
Well, you know, I think we talked about some of them around change and, you know, people feeling this sense of frustration or getting mixed messages, which I think, you know, a lot of us are feeling. I think there's also this sense, and this relates in a way to kind of looking to the experts or someone else to kind of help the situation. And this is a situation that we're all living in. So I think sometimes people get frustrated when there's not a clear answer, you know, from a priest or from a mental health professional, or, you know, why this versus this. And so that conflicting information, but we should also recognize that, you know, people come to all experiences with their own set of kind of what I think of as like psychological risk factors. So our ability to tolerate ambiguity, our frustration tolerance, you know, we all kind of come to any interpersonal experience, you know, with that as part of it. And our past history of trauma, you know, many people got activated in terms of their own personal traumas during this time. You know, people who have social anxiety or strong fears of illness, you know, all of these things kind of got activated for people in different ways. And then, you know, we should remember, like the introverts like you and me, Bob, you know, while we may have initially had this sense of, you know, wow, okay, I can navigate this. I know how to be alone. I'm great with my own company. There's a difference when it's forced isolation, right? And so I think for folks that, you know, weren't able to gather with their loved ones for significant events and all of that, you know, I think, you know, people's tolerance for that or their coping with that, they may have been more frustrated about those kind of forced isolations. So we should just be mindful that everybody kind of comes to this with their own outlook and their own, you know, even optimism, right, to some degree, whether you believe this was going to go on forever or end fairly, you know, sooner than it would, has a lot to do with your own optimism and kind of outlook. So those things, I think, can tend to differentiate and isolate some people further.
Yeah. So pretty typical for a priest to be able to, or any of the church leaders to be able to identify those with serious psychological disorders in the congregation. And so, you know, it's not unusual for for a church to have somebody with, you know, be on the autism or Asperger's spectrum, maybe somebody with bipolar disorder or even schizophrenia. Those are important, you know, kind of pretty typical that we're going to see at different, particularly larger parishes that are going to have, you know, one or maybe two people like that. But I'm wondering about, you know, as we talk about kind of the trauma activated issues that, you know, that might surprise us, that, wow, I didn't know that parishioner would have, you know, got, why is that person reacting, or how is that person reacting? I think that I think we've seen more of that. That's what you're saying these days, is that we, you know, might get surprised by somehow perhaps vulnerable or activated, I guess, that's by all of what's happened, that some of our people can be.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think it's instructive to share, you know, when we look at what happened with suicide rates, mortality rates during the first part of well, really, we have data for the first 6 months of 2020 right now. And what we've seen is that the rate of suicide death did not go up, but reports of distress went up, you know, calls to crisis lines went up. And those of us in the field have been trying to make some sense of that. Like, so what does that tell us? And one idea is that when people are experiencing something where they feel like we're all in this, we may be having a different experience of it, we're all in it, that to some degree people will rally, right? They will say, you know, I'm not alone in this. And so, but what happens when we come out of those situations and, you know, we look to things like wartime and other kind of mass events like that for information on this. But when people come out of a situation like that and they look around and they see some people are coping better and maybe they're not coping as much, or maybe they've held it together, right? And now that they feel less of an immediate threat to their physical health, their feelings and their mental health really comes to the surface. So I say all of that because I think as we move out of this, you know, we're still going to really be working with folks on their mental health. And what we might see is that for folks who really kind of, you know, kept their emotional reaction kind of close and not, we may see that there's kind of a letting down and a letting out. So people who seemed fine may suddenly not seem very okay, or may seem that they're much more agitated as we move into this post-pandemic world.
And you think that there are specific things that we can do to help ameliorate some of those factors? So there's some one or two simple things that we could that kind of take with us to say, okay, I can do that. Be on the lookout for somebody that's struggling.
I mean, I think there's a few things, and I'll just kind of list a few off. You know, I mean, clergy are aware of this, but, you know, we should never assume, right? So don't assume one over the other, and to know that this is dynamic for people, that, you know, as a therapist, I used to say, sometimes I see people on their worst hour of the week, right? And what you're really trying to get a sense of is like, how is the person doing in their world? You know, I do think, you know, the importance of listening, of helping people understand that their experience to some degree is expected given what we've all gone through, and that it's important to seek out support, mental health support or other support, kind of have a team of support in a way, so that they're having support through peers, through their faith-based community, through mental health, you know, that this is not something they should manage alone. You know, certainly we worry about folks who are having increased thoughts of self-harm or suicide at this time. But I do think, like you're saying, Bob, there's kind of like a long, there's a lot of other mental health related things that put people in crisis that are not self-harm or suicide. And what we want to do is be proactive and get ahead of that long before someone finds themselves isolated and in a suicidal crisis. So things like sharing resources, staying connected, trusting your gut, like if something doesn't seem quite right, taking an extra step to reach out. These things matter, and I think they've made a huge difference for people throughout this pandemic, and will probably be even more important as we go into this post-pandemic period.
Yeah, good. So we want to be conscious of time and just move us along here a little bit. Is we have this, then we have the two blind men. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'll just sum up. Is the two blind men come up to Jesus and say, help us. And Jesus touches their eyes and basically says, hey, well, what your faith is may be done to you. And of course, Jesus says, as he often does in the Matthew story, his healing stories, is saying, okay, don't talk to anybody about it. But they were so excited about being connected back to their community and being able to relate that these other parts of what's going on here in this healing, is that being able to be reconnected to community was so important. So here's the question: is how can a community like a church, community or parish improve the mental health of its members? What do you think about that?
I think particularly during this pandemic, one of the things we've been really mindful of is our language. So we started really liking the term socially distanced, but it rolls off your tongue, many of us saying it. We started talking about being physically distant but socially connected.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons we did that is just a recognition that people do well and thrive when they're connected to other people.
Right.
And particularly when it comes to mental health, having more people who are checking in with you, who expect you to show up, who recognize when you're not present. Those things matter to someone who's struggling with particularly with a mental health concern. So being mindful that, mental health, talking openly about it the way we do about physical health does help normalize that expression for people who may be struggling in silence. I think the role of healthy relationships can't be understated. So particularly when we think of people that are physically isolated or may, even in this post-pandemic period, not be kind of reintegrating is the way I think about it, or getting back out into the world, who are still feeling like they're very physically isolated, taking those extra steps to connect in whatever way is comfortable for that person really can make a difference.
Yeah, good. That gets into that other kind of the other two questions, and I would say to answer that third one from my point of view, two things. Is the Church Times article talked about how Archbishop Justin Welby spoke about his own struggles, mental health struggles, and the article cited and said, hey, that was a likely gave permission for a lot of clergy to be able to reach out to and take advantage of mental health, saying it was services in the UK, because there was this kind of permission to say it's okay. And equally, I have found in my own sense of when I've either talked about suicide prevention or mental health from the pulpit or in church newsletters, that it gives the congregation permission to come forward and be more honest about it. And I guess I would encourage those that are listening in to do so appropriately. Not to kind of throw everything out into a sermon or into a church newsletter, but to be willing to share and be vulnerable about some of these things. I think can really help a congregation.
I would just also add that I think anytime, I think you're right, the kind of idea of seeing those we look up to, or those we think of as kind of faring better than us, to see them talk openly about living with a mental health condition or having had a past mental health struggle can really give someone permission not only to take care of themselves, but also to talk to others.
Yeah, good. Well, here's the fourth and our last one, and I want to just be mindful. We've got enough time now. So Jesus, when he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home and suffering terribly. And he said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion replied, Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word and my servant will be healed. For I am too a man under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. I want to focus on that. I'm going to do a little bit of word study, but that word marveled, translated in the English Standard Version, it is really to wonder, to be amazed at in the Greek. And I think that we'll move into that the depth of what that word is, and I think how it imparts. But I guess a final step with these two questions here is what are those things? I mean, Jesus makes that, you know, and the servant both, and the centurion are both making each other feel comfortable here. What do you think in terms of church experience that church leaders can do on a practical sense of making their parishioners feel more comfortable as they return back to worship?
Yeah, I mean, I know, Bob, you and I've talked about this offline, and this idea of that some of the very things we do in church are things that we've been told we shouldn't be doing publicly. The singing, you know, certainly kind of speaking loudly, which for many of us, that's how we pray. You know, those things have been challenged. And so I think, you know, some of it, I think, is about clear information. You know, we've talked about kind of that, but it's also about, I think, kind of walking the walk in some ways. So like people look to us and see us doing the things we're recommending others do to be comfortable. You know, I think really just not understating the importance of seeing people kind of follow the recommendations and that leaders follow them as well. You know, I think the only other thing I would add is that, you know, while for some people their anxiety or worry may be about church attendance, we should be mindful that anxiety can be triggered by something that is often much bigger than the immediate thing.
Yeah, that's important. And
so taking some time for somebody who's expressing a lot of worry or anxiety to really maybe find out, are there bigger worries here, right? Is this a bigger worry about getting back to life than it is, you know, that's kind of informing their worry about getting back to church. So those kinds of things I think are important to just kind of look beyond the surface as well.
Yeah, I think it reminds me of somebody that I was working with during the pandemic at one church, and we had just opened up over the summer, and we could have a few people come in, and this person kind of came in, and she was really kind of a peripheral member of the congregation, but she came in with gloves on and double masked, and I think even a coat tightly wrapped around her, in speaking with the congregate, you know, with some of the other congregants afterwards, you know, she left before we could talk to her, and so I inquired about that, and to find out, lo and behold, it was just like you said, there was a lot more anxiousness going on than just her being anxious about coming to church. You know, she felt she needed to be church for her own personal spiritual needs. And they were being expressed in this way of hypersensitivity to kind of viral risk in it. And I think that if we keep that in mind as clergy, to kind of say, as we look out on our congregation and go, wow, that's kind of funny, this person is kind of really struggling. It may not just be because it's the peace coming, or singing or not singing, or being outside or not being outside, that there's often more to it. Yeah. I'm going to we're going to finish with this slide here, but I want to touch base with something that we're going to share in the share with you all as a takeaway. But before that, I just want to remark, and going back to that healing experience of Jesus, where he was in wonder at the faith of the centurion, that sense of wonder, I think, is is a mark of a healthy church, that we can pause and look at that sense of God at work. And Wendy Farley, in this wonderful book on incarnational theology, Gathering Those Driven Away, states that the restoration of wonder is the beginning of the inward journey to a God who people of faith aver is always waiting in the seeker's heart. And I think from us to kind of remember that, how do we know that we are having a church that is healthy, is when we can return to that experience of worship as wonder, and awe of God in our lives. And we've got, I think we have one. Okay, so I'm going to switch my sharing to this screen here. And just so we can have this, we're going to, Joe's going to make sure everybody gets this. This is what I've listed as a post-pandemic assessment that everybody can do and look at. And it kind of highlights the questions that you can read at your own pace, the understanding of the scoring. But what I want to highlight before we go is this sense of kind of what we're assessing, and kind of how do you feel comfortable that, hey, you know, I'm making good headway as a church leader with my congregation. So on the one hand, our parishioners can acknowledge their feelings about the pandemic and other stressors. I think we've talked, Doreen, we've talked about that. I think being able to tell those stories without worry of judgment. Can we even get to the place where we might even laugh about, you know, some of the things that have gone on? And if so, then we might be we really should be at a place where our congregation is feeling comfortable and healthy. Being focused on the church's mission as opposed to kind of everything else, whether it's kind of the political turmoil or social turmoil or pandemic turmoil, but we're focused on the church's mission. How good of a job can we do that as a parish of our parishioners? Kind of, it will indicate how well we're doing and how the anxiety level of the congregation is. And then the other pieces here is, my parish has clearly stated its expectations about illness symptoms and whether or not to attend services. I think we talked about, you know, kind of communication and expectation are really helpful about this. And also communicates clearly about the cleanliness of its buildings and aspects of worship. And I think, you know, there as one group mentioned to me, we talked about, will they allow AA back into the church? Which was a really honest question. And I think an honest statement that they were making, that how they were struggling around the cleanliness of the building after it's being used by other people and others that may or may not be considered in that sense of holiness as a Sunday morning worship group, right? And letting us struggle with the tension of that. Seeking gentleness as opposed to, my parish seeks gentleness as opposed to chaos and division and anger and disaffection. Evaluating that, how well we promote mental health awareness, and then finally speaking about and how well it speaks about and beholds wonder. Those are good. Certainly not all the factors that one could use, but I think these are good. And then I think as this last piece is, I think is pretty important, is identifying ways that we can, that we have stayed calm and courageous during the pandemic. Like, you know, give ourselves some credit for being courageous and being able to share those with others so that others can share them with us. So I wanted to make sure that that I had that for everybody. And let me go back to the slideshow. But any fine, oops, let me go, I did it. I try it again. There we go. Okay. We're gonna move, yeah, we'll just do that there. Okay, so just leaving it at that. Doreen, do you have any, we've got about 5 minutes, and I'm not sure if we have any other comments at this point, but any concluding thoughts from your end?
Yeah, well, I would like to say one thing first, Bob, as always, this has been certainly my pleasure to have this dialogue with you. And I did want to mention AFSP, which I see you have up on the screen there. Certainly for more information about mental health and suicide prevention, check us out. The last thing I'll say, maybe just as a parting note, is that, one of the things that we've been saying a lot to parents and teachers and those who have young people looking up to them, but I think is relevant here for congregations, is that you need to model taking care of your own mental health in all of this. And that the more we do that, we show people by example. And one of the things I speak a lot with parents, and I tell them quite a bit, like, if you're saying to everyone, take care of your mental health, but you're frazzled and stressed and not, you're kind of negating your message. So maybe the parting comment here is that, to not only encourage mental health among, your parishioners or your faith community, but to also make sure you're modeling that. Because we learn so much more based on what we see in addition to what we hear.
Yeah, I think reminds me, there's a new, his latest book, Peter Steinke, who is important within the clergy world as a Murray Bowen and family systems theory person. He speaks about, the importance of the congregation's emotional health is directly influenced by the emotional health of its leader. And for us to be able to, and so, if you're not feeling kind of connected well to yourself and your own feelings, probably a good idea to start a congregation, a conversation with a mental health professional. And fortunately, the church has good medical insurance in that area. For them, as far as I know, maybe some other dioceses don't have it. But if you're not able to take care of yourself and your own mental health, then the organization will suffer, and then it'll only make it worse, because you wonder, why is everybody so functioning so poorly? Can't have anything to do with me, right? So, well, good. That's it from my end, folks, and I really appreciate your time, and I'm glad to, as always, be a part of the CEEP Network's presentations, and particularly with mental health. And again, my contact information is below, and feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions. And we certainly can, I can get them back to Doreen, and we are glad to be a part of this, and wish everybody much health and blessings. Okay.